Right, welcome to everyone joining. I know there's a few last minute people because I just had about half a dozen last minute registrations come through. So I'll give it just a bit longer than usual. Right, so for those of you who haven't been at one of these before, because there's a few of you, this is our online cyber cafe Scientifique. Cafe Scientifique is a very open platform. Normally we would run in a wine bar, a coffee shop. We've run in an art gallery before and various other places, but that's not an option at the moment. So we started running online, and I'll be honest, it's been going extremely well, better than I expected. So welcome to our little Cafe Sci. Tonight we have Dr. Orban, hopefully that's the right pronunciation, talking about the psychology of technology, and I managed not to say the future of technology that time. So psychology of technology, past, present and future, looking at the impact of technology on people, whether there is an impact, hopefully settling some questions, but certainly from the brief summary I've had, opening up some new ones and some interesting ones. And we'll get to that in a minute, but just to explain how this works first, I will essentially be acting as a proxy for the audience during this. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask during the speech itself, if you just put them either in chat or in the Q&A button that you have available, I will rudely interrupt Dr. Orban and ask them. And otherwise, we'll let Dr. Orban speak and then follow up with a Q&A at the end. If there's a particularly interesting question which is getting into more of a discussion point, then I can switch on speaking for anyone in the audience so that you can get into more of a debate. And with that, unless there are any questions. Oh, the only other thing is, if you do have any technical difficulties, questions around that during, please just click the raise hand button or send a chat message and I'll get in touch with you privately over text just to sort it out so that we're not interrupting everyone else. Right.
Great.
All yours.
Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation. We were messaging before we actually before the lockdown. So it was always a plan to turn up here at some point now over cyberspace. So I'm just going to share my screen so you can all see my slides. Okay, great. So in short, I'm a research, oh, I think those are the wrong slides because it says LSE on the top. So I will introduce myself while I find my right slides. So I'm a research fellow in experimental psychology at the University of Cambridge, affiliated with Emmanuel College. They pay my bills, but I work at, normally I go to work at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences unit. And I've been working on technology and how it affects mainly adolescents for 5 years now. So now that I have the right slides, I will continue with the talk. So I hope to take about 30 minutes and run you through some of the thoughts I've been having around not just the current technologies we have that we're concerned about, social media, smartphones, maybe video games, but put it into historical contexts. So kind of think a bit more on the kind of one level up, you know, like you sometimes do with a pint in your hand. That was actually my plan. I've now got myself a glass of water. So maybe in the questions, I need to get myself my pint. And then kind of zoom into social media and technology and what we know there. Okay, so so that's what I kind of said, is that we're going to go through the past to the present and then into the future to really figure out how we respond to technologies and why we often kind of do things wrong and we're very concerned about them. I originally got interested in this because I came across this journal article from 1941. And in this article, Mary Preston, she's a psychologist down at Stanford. And in the 40s, she invited about 100 children into her lab because she was interested in how they reacted both to kind of movies and radio crime dramas. And she found quite crazy results, or concerning, not crazy. But what she found is that these terrifying scenes, both of the radio and in movies, can have an inhibitory effect on the function of every organ in the body. And I highlighted at the bottom that most of the children utilize the addiction to these technologies as an escape from reality, much as a chronic alcoholic does drink. So here she is saying that this radio and movies seem to really affect the body, and that these effects don't just kind of continue and then fade away. They're really addictive, and they're as addictive as things like alcohol and drugs. For me, that was quite interesting. At the time when this article was written, this was when the radio was becoming extremely popular. You can see by the graph that the popularity in the US in both rural and urban areas was really spiking in the 1940s. And I think this tells us something really important about why this research has begun to look at radio. So in the 1940s, you had about 80% of households owning a radio, while in the 1930s, it was only about 40%. So that's a doubling in a decade. And that is quite a rapid uptake of technology. And children at the time in the 1940s started spending about 1 to 3 hours a day listening to the radio. So what we see already here is that when technologies kind of get some sort of gain in popularity, when they start taking up our children's time, our adolescents' time, when they start really changing the way we function and we use our leisure time, people start to become concerned. What I normally do is do a quiz with like people raising hands, but that's not going to work right now. So just
we can actually have hands raised if you just ask people.
It's going to take too long. I'll moderate it, and I think it will be fine. But what I have put together is a couple of quotes from scientific and media and policy articles, and I want you just to kind of think for yourselves if these quotes are about the radio or about smartphones and social media. So the first quote is, "No locks will keep this intruder out, nor can parents shift their children away from it." So this was written by the director of the Child Study Association of America. And I've given variants of this talk in various lengths before, and you normally get quite a 50-50 split with people thinking this might be about the radio and other people thinking it might be about smartphones. So it is actually from 1935. So it is about the radio there. But it could have easily been said today. Here is another one. So here's a device that is everywhere. We may question the quality of its offerings for our children. We may approve or deplore its entertainments and enchantments, but we are powerless to shut it out. It comes into our very homes and captures our children before our very eyes. This was from a parenting magazine, and because parenting magazines aren't really a thing anymore, we can see that this is also about the radio, written in 1939. But again, this is almost what we talk about today with screens in the home as well, this powerlessness and this capturing of attention. And lastly, it's giving your child blank is like giving them a gram of cocaine. This normally gets almost 100% of people saying that that's the smartphone, and that's true. So I actually took this from a headline which was telling us that giving your child a smartphone is like giving them a gram of cocaine, says top addiction expert. So what we see is that it's almost a mirroring. There's a mirroring between the concerns that people had for radio and the research that was being done, and the concern that we now have about social media and smartphones. And that, for me, is really interesting. And I don't only think this is present when solely comparing radio and smartphones. It's more of a cycle. So technology panics are inherently cyclical. So they come and go, and they're always pretty much the same. They're pretty similar. And I'm not the first to say this. I'm quite late on kind of really understanding this. In 1935, even, people were already saying that the radio seems like just another panic that looks very similar. Here, and this is one of my last quotes, I promise, I just really like them. Looking backward, radio appears but the latest of cultural emergence to invade the putative privacy of the home. Each such invasion finds the parents unprepared, frightened, resentful, and helpless. With comparatively short time, the movie, the automobile, the telephone, and the cheap paperback book have had similar effects upon the apprehensions and solicitudes of parents. So for me, this is really a cycle. We seem to become concerned about technologies that reach a certain level of popularity in society. And then that concern is kind of projected into research, where people like me are trying to figure out what is actually going on with these technologies. Are they actually harming our children? And what are they doing? And I'm just going to give you a short overview of how this cycle looks like, in my mind at least, and what drives it. So there's kind of 4 different steps. So there's the panic creation, which is the kind of societal feeling of being concerned about something that starts gripping our attention and this new technology. Then this causes political pressure to kind of show that you're doing something. And politicians use these panics in quite specific ways throughout history. They then kind of often outsource the problem to science, and researchers really struggle to make sense of a new technology because they treat every technology as new, and they kind of reinvent the wheel for each new technology, which means progress is very slow. And actually, oftentimes, we don't actually understand whether a technology was good or bad. We just lose interest because a new technology comes around that we're more concerned about. So I'll go through this step by step, and I hope it makes a bit of sense, trying to keep it quite kind of broad. So let's look at step 1, the step of panic creation. Why do we get concerned about a new technology that comes around and that starts kind of being popular in our society? And there's a couple of different ways you could approach it. The first is that of technological determinism. So this is how we normally feel about technologies and approach them. And researchers, especially in sociology, have been really thinking about this. And that is that we normally think about technologies as very basic and fundamental things that seem to affect our lives. They're the drivers of changes in society. And we're not very powerful, or we're not very able to actually affect them back. So we are affected by these technologies. They're very impactful, and actually that's a one-way street. The way we use them or the way we want to use them doesn't really affect them. So technological determinism is quite a powerful force, because we see these technologies as powerful forces. And in society, there are trends all the time, and these are kind of the icons on the left. You have economies going down, or mental health crises rising, suicide rates going up. We have changes in behavior like youth violence, and we have changes in how people feel. And these trends happen over an extremely long period of time, but they're often very present in our mind. For example, the increase in stabbings last year in London was quite prominent in the media and prominent in our thinking. And technologies are really easily linked to these trends because we see them as such a powerful force that does changes in society. So what we routinely see is that these long-term trends or short-term trends in society are linked quite easily by the press, by people themselves, or by researchers to these changes in technology, so that we get statements like, youth violence was caused by YouTube videos or by grime artists, or that, and these narratives haven't just, they weren't just in existence last summer. Youth violence has been a problem for decades, and youth violence was pinned to jazz. Youth violence was pinned to Dungeons and Dragons. Youth violence was pinned to other forms of violent video games. And so we see these trends in things that society cares about being linked to technologies very easily. So this is just a short overview of why I think that panics often arise. And these panics, just a last note, often arise for teenagers and children because we're concerned about leisure time. And I don't have time to really go into this. This is a talk about kind of by itself, talking about leisure time. So please do ask me about it if you're interested. But we, over the last century, we've become increasingly concerned about what especially children and teenagers spend their leisure time doing. And so once the technology encroaches onto that leisure time, we also see that spike in concern. Okay, so that's kind of panic creation. So what do I mean by political outsourcing? And here I draw some very generalizations that are kind of, there are a lot more nuanced in my thinking than I will be describing today. But overall, what we know is that there are political benefits of societal panics. We see that politicians often use these panics as to show that they're willing to stand up to emerging technology companies, that they're really concerned about vulnerable groups like children, that they listen to the population. And we see that again and again, whether that's Matt Hancock saying he'll stand up to Facebook and Instagram to remove self-harm images, or whether that's the US Congress subcommittee standing up to television companies or movie companies saying that Spider-Man is actually really bad for kids because they make kids do kind of aggressive things, and that Spider-Man should be removed.
We've just had a question come in about kids and adults, actually, and is the difference in uptake across the generations part of the panic, and do the older generation not understand the attraction?
I think it's definitely part of the thing is that society, the people that drive conversations in society are often people of older generations, and this is something that kind of sociologists often refer to in kind of moral panics, is that when people get concerned, the real drivers are the people that people listen to in society, and the people that can make decisions, the media editors, the people who decide what goes onto the website and what we read and what we hear. And these are often not the people actually using the technologies at the very beginning, because the people who are often the first adopters or the first age group that are kind of the people who adopt the technology most are younger generations, often adolescents and teenagers, just because it's, at least in the last century, these are all social products in a way, and social contact is really crucial for them. And so I do think that there's the mismatch between the people actually in power and then the not using the technologies as much, and the younger generations using it more. I think something else is that we're often panicked about people who are not ourselves. So I think in a quote from 1970s, when they were looking into this, they said that, people are interestingly immune to the thing that they're actually concerned about. Often they're concerned about children doing dangerous things because of watching something, or teenagers, or women, or immigrants. So it's often the lesser powerful groups that we become concerned about, because we ourselves often feel more in control, for example. Hope that answered your question. So
I think it did. There was another one that just came in while you were speaking then.
Yeah.
Stanley Kubrick banned his own film, Clockwork Orange, because young people were copying its violence. Now, was that more about the content than the technology?
Yeah, content is naturally a big part of concerns about technologies, especially television and video games. We've seen that really play a part. So I don't really go into content a huge amount. I do think some content regulation is beneficial. So I wouldn't say that, the kind of concern around content is completely futile or stupid. I think it is really important to think about what we see as a society. It's kind of separate a bit from the kind that often the concern is about television or radio for quite a long period of time, or smartphones or social media, before people start moving into discussing more about the content or the motivations or the specific types of use. So we often see a progression over time that at the very beginning, when a technology comes around, people are very concerned about it as a whole, and then they start realizing that it's not smartphones in general that are harmful. It might be looking at self-harm images on Instagram. Any others?
Not yet. I'm
Cool.
sure there will be more at this rate.
Well, please go ahead. So we were at politicians kind of taking this as an opportunity, or as a political pressure, really, from their electorate to show that they're doing something, and that they see the concern about children and teenagers, and that they're going to stand up to these companies. And we see this again and again. Furthermore, some people have written quite compellingly about how a panic about technology and its link to maybe a negative trend in society helps deflect attention from more difficult issues. For example, a lot of people agree that we're currently in a mental health crisis, and linking it to social media doesn't blame parents. It doesn't blame maybe your party's austerity measures and shutting down of youth clubs, or the lack of mental health support, both in the NHS and in schools. Instead, it really blames it on an external factor. So it is quite easy to proportion that blame as well. And yeah, I just put that here. This was at a time when he was still doing other things, but there has been this push quite publicly to stop self-harm images and suicide posts from being, and online harms from existing on the internet. Something that's, I think, has been delayed quite a bit because of the whole elections and things. So I think people are starting to see that's a lot more difficult to do. But there's a lot of posturing, and when you as a politician say you're going to, stand up to these companies, it does generate a lot of positive headlines. So I often talk about this with researchers and academics as well, because we kind of dissociate politics and science completely, and we kind of treat them as completely separate, but they are inherently linked. In the last century, we're moved away from this gentleman science model where people can just sit down and study what they're interested in. We're in a funding model where we're supposed to solve problems in society, and there's very strict kind of funding rules. And in that way, policy and politics can start governing what scientists look at. So what we often get is that interest in society leads to an increase in funding and scientists just being interested in the topic, and a real increase in work done in this area. We see this with social media. 5-6 years ago when I started, this wasn't really a great field to work in. People weren't really interested. And now it's really kind of hot topic, as we say. And there's tens and hundreds of new researchers joining into this effort. So that's kind of step 2, this taking of a societal concern, making it into a policy and political problem, and then starting to get science involved and people starting to research this work. Brings me to that I don't think the research is actually done very well. We often, and that's because research kind of takes a long time to do. If you really want to do science well, you need a theory that is tested for a long time, that is developed. And actually the way we do research on technologies is often completely different. It's like, oh, here's a new technology and let's just have a look what happens. And the research community oftentimes just forgets that previous technologies existed, and they kind of not consider any of the technologies that came before, for example, social media. And so a lot of new researchers come in to study social media, and they don't learn anything from the researchers that studied television or video games or radio. And they seem to then go through the same stages that I hinted at in the question before. People first study the kind of new technology as a whole and start realizing that that actually isn't very good, and start then trying to look at different contents or different users or different motivations. So they're losing a lot of time. And we see the same questions being raised about, for example, technology addiction again and again and again. And so it seems very wasteful for there not to be any continuity between the work from various technologies. But this isn't really a talk about these kind of societal or scientific problems. But it is really important to note that there are real inefficiencies in a system that kind of restarts every single time a new technology develops. And that this restarting has real consequences. So the scientific philosopher of science, actually, Kuhn, in the 1960s, wrote really compellingly about what happens when there's no real underlying theory or paradigm to guide research here. And he said that without this paradigm, each researcher is forced to build each researcher, sorry, that's a typo of mine, is forced to build his or her field anew from its foundations. So there's kind of a restart without this guiding paradigm. And what he said is that if this is the case, that such a time should be marked by frequent and deep debates over legitimate methods and problems and standards of solutions, and that these serve rather to define schools than to produce agreement. So what he means here is that if there's no guiding principles, if there's no established way of doing things, if you just kind of restart a research area, there's going to be so much debate that you'll have people split into groups that kind of have very different ways of thinking, and they'll never really reach a consensus. And we see this throughout technology research. See this with video games. You know, there's been 25 years, as this article says, 25 years of research on kind of whether video game violence causes aggression. And there's two kind of it's like trench warfare, where there's some researchers who think that it does, some researchers who think that it doesn't, and there hasn't been any consensus. And I don't think that giving the field an additional 25 years will lead to any more consensus, really. And the same with smartphones. And so this is also turned into a bit of trench warfare. So I've been arguing, for example, that smartphones, we don't actually have any concrete evidence that they actively harm people. It should be the content and the specific uses. But there are researchers that feel like they are generally harmful. And for example, here, Jane Twenge, who wrote iGen, a very popular book kind of discussing this issue, wrote in Time magazine, kind of saying that my research was dumb. So it said that recently several analyses have said that the research on smartphone use is a mess and that there's no connection to mental health. Don't believe them. So for a scientist to kind of go into the public sphere to write something so publicly is quite an intense move, and it shows that we also have kind of trench warfare in this area. So I'm saying this so you can take everything that I say from now on with a pinch of salt. No.
While we're talking about trench warfare and reactions, just had another question in. Are there any technologies, I think I know the answer to this one, that have been introduced, proved popular, and not caused panic?
Well, I think technologies are a really broad term, like hand mixers probably didn't cause any panics, and there are technologies, but then trains did. So trains were supposed to meld your brain.
I seem to remember something about the dishwasher causing a bit of a moral panic when it came in because people would have too much free time.
Yeah, I think there must be some. So I really just work on the media sorts of technologies, and I do think that there's some important factors like kind of infringement of leisure time and changing the behaviors that are important. So maybe if there's new technologies that don't 100% change the behaviors, or where people quickly agree that it's a positive change. For example, kind of the vaccine. If we get a vaccine, that's also, philosophers of science would define that as a technology. And well, there'll be anti-vaxxers. Anyway, but there won't be a widespread social panic, I hope. Yeah, good question.
And we've had another one asking if research has used brain imaging to check the impact of certain content, such as violence, or just technology on a child's brain, and which areas of the brain are effective, if any. And there's a mention of an article by Victoria Dunkley claiming that it does affect the brain.
Yeah, so brain imaging studies have been far and few between. So the ones that do exist are often on really small samples, so we don't really know very well what they show. So there have been, maybe I'll get to that at the end. So a lot of brain imaging studies on socializing. We're very interested in the social brain and how it reacts to social stimuli. Naturally, in a brain scanner, you can't have a person talking to a person face to face. So it has been using all the technologies to mediate social contact in a brain scanner. So that has given us quite a good indication of kind of how the brain reacts to receiving social content over, for example, a screen, or seeing likes turn up. There's been less good work kind of on specifically the media. It's hard. Brain imaging, it often shows that an area lights up in the brain when a child looks at X, or not. Children are really hard to brain image, so it's often kind of older children or adults, but it doesn't actually tell us a lot about what actually happens then. It doesn't translate into behavior. So I don't know exactly the study that was mentioned, but there's no conclusive kind of brain imaging evidence of, for example, smartphones causing harm. Or if you would put a teenager in a scanner to look at self-harm images, yes, you would probably see certain areas of the brain light up. But what else does it tell us is very hard to then keep on going from there. So I sit in a brain imaging institute, so I should be less critical. But yeah.
And one last one, a follow up to that, more of a comment. I've never heard the introduction of plumbing or hygiene technology in general causing panic.
Okay, well then maybe that's the thing that I was looking for. Yeah, Victorian plumbing systems. Probably not a panic on that. We might be wrong. Okay, so I'm almost done with the cycle. So where we're now at is that, yes, the wheel's reinvented. This could be a whole book of mine. There's loads of inefficiencies, and actually research doesn't build an evidence base quickly enough. Now that people are really concerned about social media, or the last 2 years, we were doing extremely basic research on social media, but social media had existed for 10 years. We should have been a lot quicker a lot further along, so we could actually answer policy relevant questions or questions society are really concerned about earlier on. But there's a lot of lack of evidence in the area, which leads to the last is that there is very little progress. And especially things like video games or television or even the radio, there was never really a conclusion to this panic. It just kind of fizzled out because a new technology came along. And I would bet quite a bit of money that it'll be the same with things like social media, that the concern will increase. We might gain a bit more information about what happens to us when we use social media, but actually we'll never come to that conclusion. And instead, the kind of interest and the funding and the research will kind of refocus onto a new technology, which will cause the next bout of concern, which is actually quite problematic in policy settings, because you could argue that we never actually appropriately regulate these technologies because we never actually come to understanding what they truly affect and how they truly affect us. Okay, so I will pivot for the next 10 minutes, hopefully. I know that I'm overrunning, but that's because of the question. Okay, well, for the next 5 to 10 minutes, I'll talk a bit about what we know about especially kind of social media, a bit about kind of modern digital technologies in general. This is where I do my work. The kind of philosophizing about cycles of technology panics is more of a recent endeavor. So what we do know is that if you take a data set and you open it up and it's, for example, about teenagers and their use of social media and their well-being, you would normally find a negative correlation between these two variables. Very small negative correlation, that those teenagers that report using more social media also report having lower well-being or lower mental health. This tells us nothing about the kind of causal structure. It could well be that those, for example, children of parents in lower socioeconomic status areas often use a lot more technology because parents often have to work more, they have less after-school activities, and in those lower socioeconomic status areas, we've known for decades that there are lower scores of well-being. So that could actually be driving the correlation without there being any causal relationship in itself. We don't know. I think it's probably a bit of both, but it is very small, and I'll talk about the size in a bit. And then there's been experimental work where they've asked people to not use social media, not use Facebook, and they've tracked how their well-being changes over time. So this helps us try to tease apart these causal pathways, but they've actually been very mixed results. So in The Guardian, I think a year ago, there was a headline that going off Facebook for 5 days decreases your cortisol level. Cortisol level is a stress hormone, so it's kind of seen as a positive, it de-stresses you. But actually in the same study, something that wasn't reported is that life satisfaction dropped. So cortisol levels dropped, but your life satisfaction as well. So there's often been very kind of inconsistent reporting of results as well. So this is a bit of my work where I try to find a way to communicate the size of the correlation to policymakers. So I've worked with the House of Commons Science and Technology Select Committee and the Chief Medical Officer on screen time guidelines. And so what we really want to know is that negative correlation actually worth our time? And so here is a graph where I compare the size of the correlation between well-being and something else. So in the purple, you see the correlation between well-being and digital technology use in kids in a British sample of 10,000. And you see that it's negative. So there's like the zero axis, the zero line, which isn't a line, and it's kind of going negative. And then being left or right-handed was hypothesized that it shouldn't have any sort of correlation. And we see that there. It's a very, very tiny negative correlation. How tall the child is, or if they use their bicycle a lot, have positive correlations that are still small, a bit bigger than the technology use. And at the bottom, you see that wearing glasses is negatively related to well-being, and is actually a bit more negatively related than technology use. This doesn't tell us that we should ban glasses in schools. It doesn't tell us that actually glasses are more harmful than technology use. Again, there's no causal inference we can do here, but it does show us in what sort of teeny tiny land we're actually working in when we talk about this prominent and persistent negative correlation between use of digital technologies and social media and well-being. So the second thing is the question about, okay, so we have this correlation now. So in what direction do these effects go? So naturally, the policy and the parenting question is causal. We want to know, if my teenager uses more social media on a day, how do they feel the next day? Does it negatively impact them or not? And we often default, when we see these correlations, to a causal argument that kind of social media use leads to a decrease in mental health, or social media use leads to a decrease in well-being. But actually, the directional links are really unclear. So work that I've done with my colleagues, or work that was done in the States, show that actually it's a two-way street. It's not a one-way street of social media affecting well-being and mental health. Actually, also, for example, if there's a drop in life satisfaction in a teenager, that also predicts an increase in social media use later on. So we have that kind of an increase in social media use of a teenager has been linked to a decrease in life satisfaction, but also a decrease in life satisfaction has been linked to an increase in social media use. So this shows that we're actually working with something that's inherently complicated. It's probably affected by loads of different things. How we feel is a network of complicated factors, and social media probably plays a small part there. What we have seen consistently, though, emerging over time now in the last year of research in this area, is these gender differences. So we see these directional effects of social media leading to changes in well-being or life satisfaction or mental health, and well-being, I'll just use well-being as a general term, leading to increase in social media, mainly in girls, and especially of kind of an early adolescence of, I would say, about 11 to 16. And teenage boys, we see that a lot less. And so this is what I'm working on now, is actually trying to figure out, do we have a certain population of teenagers that are more affected by their use of these technologies than others? And that's because it's actually really important for us to know this. So what we have is a small negative correlation on average. And in psychology, we average often across the whole population. So for example, the whole population of teenagers. And it might look like this, all teenagers are bunched up here in the middle, and there's not a lot of variation. So everybody has this very small negative correlation. And so maybe we shouldn't really care because glasses also have them. And maybe we don't need to change policy or push social media companies to change their design. But maybe it looks like this, the distribution, so that some teenagers are quite negatively kind of affected, some are quite positively affected, but because we're averaging, we just find kind of a very small negative correlation. And so
we've just had a question come in on that.
Yeah.
Are effects additive? If you wear glasses to use your smartphone, is that more negative than just wearing glasses or just using a smartphone?
I couldn't see the causal link there for it to be additive. I think what the correlations show us is probably, for glasses, it's probably yes, maybe the glasses leading to ostracism in school, which leads to low well-being, or certain kids wear glasses while certain kids wear contacts, and so and the more popular kids wear contacts, and so there are a lot of different effects. So I don't know if you could add those together, but there is often a debate about additive effects in social media research, where they say, even a very, very small negative effect of social media on well-being, if that happens every single day, it could add up to something really important. Or if it happens to every single person in society, that might be really important. Maybe then a very small effect actually is really, really kind of worthwhile to look at. And we still don't really know. And it really boils down to that, while this is a correlation, we don't actually know that it's social media causing the changes. And so that's why it's very hard to call for action. Going back to these distributions, which kind of shows the difficulty of devising good policy recommendations, for example, as a chief medical officer or the Royal Society for Pediatrics, is that it could also look like this, so that there are, and I think you can see my cursor from previous experience, but that at the left, there are kind of a group of children that have quite a negative correlation, and those that have quite a positive, and that there's actually two wholly different populations that react differently to, for example, social media use, and we don't know. And so this is really important for us to actually figure out over time, to actually know what technologies do to the youngest in society. The last slide that I have is that screen time sucks. So I haven't really talked about screen time today. I've been trying to avoid it more and more. But a lot of these talks and a lot of the debate, even now in kind of coronavirus times, is about screen time. This increase of screen time, is that a negative thing? Screen time being linked to various things. But screen time isn't a thing. The time we spent on screens isn't like a drug that we inject or a molecule that causes certain changes in the body. Yeah, you could discuss about the very niche area of kind of vision research and screens, but the things that parents are normally interested in about well-being, about socializing, about attention, they're all things that we cannot actually measure kind of one unit of screen time affecting them. It's more the activities done by the screens that are important, and I'll talk about that in a second. Furthermore, screen time isn't measured well. So throughout these studies, and this is a big caveat for all of this work, is that we rely on asking adults and teenagers how much they use, for example, social media. So you go to a teenager, you ask them, how much did you use social media on average on a weekday in the last couple of months? I don't know how much I use social media every day. It's really hard to actually estimate. And there's increasing evidence that actually the estimate is often completely off. And so we currently rely mainly on these estimates, and that's a big problem and something that there's a big push to try to change. And so I think the focus on screen time as a whole has often been misleading our efforts. We need to actually think about activities done online and the motivations of that and the effects on different users. I see a question appearing, but I'll just finish off with a quick metaphor that I often use with journalists that I think explains this really well. And that's that nobody would trust me as a scientist if I told them, I know exactly how this child that I picked off the street, or your child, or this child that's currently been seen by a GP is going to react to eating the 3 sugar cubes without any information about the child. Because if the child is a diabetic, eating those 3 sugar cubes might actually have a really negative effect on it. It might even, if it's a severe diabetic, go into really harmful kind of areas. But if the child had just played football with their friends, has just come off the pitch, and those 3 sugar cubes might be really helpful, replenishing their energy for after half time to go back on the pitch and try their best. So who we're talking to is really important. The motivation is important as well. Is the child eating this as a chocolate bar, for example, because they're lonely or sad, or because they're hungry, or because it's their birthday? Are we talking about eating these sugar cubes, once every minute, or once every hour, once every day, once every week? And so this sort of nuance around diet is what we have already in our vocabulary and in our societal discussion about, for example, eating sugar. But we have it a lot less about the debate about screen time. There's no way to predict how a specific child will react to X units of screen time, minutes of screen time. It'll depend on what type of screen use, what they're looking at, the content, their motivations. Are they doing that to connect or to waste time because they're bored or because they're sad? Does this screen time happen, every hour or every day? And so we really need to move towards that nuanced point of view. And if that's the only thing you take from this talk, I think this is the most important part, because I think once we get to that point where we're studying, for example, how a specific age of teenager coming from this background with this mental health difficulty reacts to screens, that will be more similar to, for example, trying to figure out how a certain type of pre-diabetic child would react to a certain diet plan, which is actually a thing that science can answer, rather than how will this child react to eating these 3 sugar cubes. And now I'm open for questions.
Okay, so the question that just came in, or comment, was, I used to think screens were hypnotic because they flickered at just below a perceptive level, but I was wrong because they don't flicker now and people don't watch them less. And on a personal note on that one, that's from someone who fortunately allowed me a lot of screen time when I was a kid. Otherwise, I would not be running this sort of thing now. So, yeah, thank you very much for that. If anyone does have any questions, now's the time to ask them. I think we've got about 10 minutes before the normal intermission, so it'll depend what we get in. But yeah, I am curious. So basically, any technology, anything new causes some form of panic, particularly if it's a new media delivery. And there doesn't seem to be any strong correlation or effective research in working out why that panic would be. Is that basically it?
Well, I think the problem is that researchers like me are fighting fires now for the last 4 years on panics around social media, and there's a lot of effort wasted on that. And I think instead, if as a society we'd realize that this is actually a cycle, we should be funding work now on what we think might be the panic in 2025, if that's, and there are a lot of scary things happening that the kind of data collection from kids very early on that can build detailed personality profiles before they can actually decide, for example, what they're watching on YouTube, smart toys, or kind of augmented reality. These are all things that I could see becoming a concern, but that aren't yet. So if we could start collecting data on that now, we'll actually have the longitudinal work and the large scale work we need to, that once the concern's actually there, we can give advice, which at the moment the field's very reactive. While there are a couple of researchers that have the foresight to look at something before it caused concern, a lot of the work only starts to emerge once there is societal pressure to do so. So I think that's the problem. I think there has been, the understanding that new technologies cause concern isn't new. Like, more the thinking around moral panics and technological determinism has been there for a long time. But I think we could still do better in a policy perspective in kind of trying to address them quicker. And there are lovely philosophy books about this, where philosophers try to figure out what you could do to actually be better at this. And for example, what they say is that maybe, and this is especially pertinent now in that, stage and giving scientific advice when there's not enough evidence or where evidence is conflicting. What the philosophers often say is that maybe you should have like a science court where you have 5 scientists that they just have to make a decision, and you like lock them away and they just need to decide. But yeah, I think there's a lot of thinking around how to make this better, but there's not a lot put into practice.
Quite a few more questions coming in. So does your research dwell on or look at habit?
And not specifically. So I mainly program kind of large scale data analyses, and habit is something difficult to look at when you only sample large amounts of people every year. There has been a bit more on, for example, people really overestimate. So there's now new research where they track not just the time you spend on your phone, but how often you open and close social media. And they found that people often overestimate the amount of time they spend on social media in a day, but they underestimate the amount of time they open it. So there seems to be a habit in kind of routinely checking it that we don't normally realize as much. But there's not been a huge amount of work kind of taking that further. They're kind of relating that to maybe problematic use habits or outcomes.
On that one, we've had another one come in related. Can the device we use not give accurate time spent and even what we have been watching and doing when online?
Yes, it can. So there is a huge drive now. So this is the kind of pressure. So the problem is that a lot of the data, for example, about what content we see when we scroll through social media or TikTok or Snapchat is collected and it is stored. It's often stored on proprietary servers of companies with very little access to researchers that aren't employed by that company. So there's a lot of information and knowledge, for example, about the effects of certain content internally at Facebook, and they change the design, for example, of showing likes dependent on that research, but it's not in the public domain, and therefore it cannot inform recommendations given by, for example, the chief medical officer who spent a lot of time last year looking into this research. So that's the one thing, is that in the model we have now, more or less any data collected on a social media site is closed off from researchers if we don't sign very strict NDAs, which is very problematic. So there has been work, for example, where you ask a person to open up their screen time tracking app that is now in iOS and Android. But again, it's not very clear the algorithms that are used to actually track that. So it could change over the course of the study and you wouldn't know. So I think it does allow you a bit of leeway in tracking time. So I think the hope is that this will be rolled out to actual large-scale studies that the UK government funds to actually look at that tracker. There is now, in the current crisis, I'm working on a study where you actually have an app which tracks use on the smartphone themselves. It's often quite privacy invasive, and it's still something we need to figure out how to do well, kind of mining that information off people's phones and people giving informed consent. So there's a real split between research done internally in Silicon Valley or in, King's Cross and research done in the public domain. For example, in Stanford, they've started something called the Screenome Project, where every couple of minutes they take almost like a screenshot from a person's phone, and then that's used to look at kind of what they're doing. And that's really rich, important data and something we really need. But I don't think it would get through UK research ethics, because what if a person is watching child porn and what do you do with that? Do you need to report them? What if somebody is talking about suicidality or a friend texts the person with something? So there's a lot of issues, but we need to move in that direction. Yes, we need better data, and there are ways. And I think that the UK government is leaning towards a data levy, so actually forcing companies to disclose some of their data. And I think that is the way that we need to go in the long term. Yeah. Oh, you're muted. Yeah, there we go.
So this is the next thing. Studies in the past provided
You sound like a robot. Well, if not, I can have a look at the Q&A. If there's any. What can be, can you? No, okay, I'm just going to answer some questions in the list. I can't really comment on 5G From what I know from tech journalists, I think it should be fine. But there's no way that I know anything about this. So the next is part of the problem that time spent on screen means time is not being spent doing other things. Oh, this is a really interesting question. So, and it shows that so the way that we often, the kind of folk theory, the way that we often think about technology is what we call the displacement hypothesis. So that any time spent on screens is a time, oh, we need to clap for the care for the NHS. I can see in my street, so I'll clap in my mind. But yeah, maybe I'll answer that and then we can go clap. But the idea is that any time spent on screens is a time not spent doing something more worthwhile. And while I think that is the classic way to think about it, we need to challenge that a bit, because it often comes from a very kind of middle class advantage way of thinking. In that, for example, if you're growing up in a very crime-ridden neighborhood of Chicago, maybe playing video games and not being out on the street might actually be beneficial, because you're not engaged in, for example, high crime behavior. And so I think that, yes, there is some merit to the displacement hypothesis, but I've been doing work with Barnardo's trying to kind of counter that sometimes we actually cannot use that way of thinking. Are you back on track, James? No. No. So I think in the chat, so there are people going to clap for the NHS. So you'll have to type it. Should I answer one more question? Yeah, okay. So there's a question about saying your work is pressurized by, so that the kind of talking about my simplification about that my work is pressured by the media and societal attention away from something that I think is useful. I think it is partly. A lot of my work has been trying to almost debunk claims that I think are way too simplistic about screen time, for example, harming kids. And I wish I could have spent a lot more time around individual differences or differences in uses way earlier. I think a lot of my work has kind of been very general. So I do think that that the kind of panic does divert research attention. I think a panic should divert research attention because we should inform society and policy. But I think if we could be more proactive, then we'll be able to actually give more informed information earlier on to actually quench that panic. And that kind of goes to the next question, which is about how you can invert a panic without being patronizing. I don't think we can stop people being concerned about new technologies. I think it's quite a kind of natural evolutionary thing to do, but I think we can do it. We can provide them with the necessary information way earlier on and kind of combat kind of people that hype up the concern to, for example, sell books or make money earlier by having better research earlier on. I think James has now been completely frozen.
Hello, Amy.
Hello.
Hi. James is having technology issues, so I'm temporarily co-hosting in his stead. I think you've only got one more question left, actually.
Okay.
Oh, it's gone. Maybe you just answered it.
Ooh, I don't know.
Your work is pressurized by media and societal issues.
I did try to answer that.
Right. And we have no more pending questions as far as
okay.
That was fascinating, and I tried to live tweet it the whole time, but I think I got a bit flippant, so we'll have to, I may go in and edit some of it.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I've deleted all my tweets pre-2017 because of that.
Thank you so much for taking part in this. As you say, I think we booked you in before COVID broke out, but interestingly, I asked Amy to participate in a remote session to a live Cafe Sci. That is, our Cafe Sci is held in we were held in an art gallery in actual fact. But because I saw that Amy had been into giving remote talks, I asked her to try out the idea of giving a remote talk to a live audience. Then we got rather overtaken by events. And now you're giving a remote talk to a remote audience. So when we get...
Well, I wanted to go to the Pizza Express in Woking. I was looking forward to my visit.
Exactly. Yeah, we can take you there, actually. We can go there. And by the way, the manager's coffee at Pizza Express is absolutely awesome. It's a special.
Huh?
You have to beg them for it because it's for the manager. It's the best.
Well, another reason to come. Yeah. Well, no, it was great. It was great.
And we've had a lot of very good feedback on it. And I'd like to thank you very much for taking part. These things are organised now by James. I set up the Cafe Sci in Woking and it's now 5 years old, but James heroically took on the whole idea of making it go online during isolation. I think that's worked extremely well. So apart from the fact that he's broken all the technology, I'd like to thank him for actually setting it up and knowing how to make it work. And hi, James, his dad. And I took over. So that's really cool.
Okay.
Okay, the talks will be streamed live on all the recorded versions will be on all the major platforms, and anyone who's interested in my amazing live tweeting of it, look me up on Twitter and you can follow it there. But thanks very much, Amy, and good night, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Well, it's fascinating, wasn't it?
Yeah.